They were 19, and by the cold measure of the world, they called her a beggar. She had no family left, no roof that belonged to her, no name on any deed in the county of Cedar Hollow. The bank, through the hand of a man named Thaddeus Corwin, had foreclosed on the forge where she had lived since she was a girl, citing a debt formalized in ink 3 days after her mentor's funeral. She had $11.40 to her name, the whole of what remained after the relocation sum Corwin's bank had pressed upon her like a closing of accounts. With it, she would travel west to a half-forgotten town called Ashford Springs, and there, at a tax auction no one else wanted to attend, she would pay $2 for a sealed icehouse that had stood shuttered for 40 years, its door nailed shut, its windows boarded, its name struck from every ledger but one. The men of that town would laugh at her for it. They did not know that behind those boards was a secret that would not only feed her, but would feed an entire community that had been quietly starving since the day the ice house closed, and that it would, in its own slow and silent way, undo the very man who had cast her out 1,000 miles to the east. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara May Whitfield. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments below. Clara was born in the spring of 1881 in a clapboard house behind the forge on Mercer Street in Cedar Hollow, a town built on iron and river trade in the rolling hill country where Ohio met its own forgetting. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her father, a quiet freight handler with a weak chest, had followed her mother into the churchyard before Clara turned 7, taken by the same winter fever that swept through the rail yards that year. She had no aunts who would claim her, and no uncles who could be found, and so the town, in the unceremonious way small towns often manage such things, simply absorbed her. She was raised, in the loosest sense of the word, by the forge itself and by the man who ran it, a barrel-chested blacksmith named Otis Pruitt, who had known her father since they were boys, and who took her in not out of obligation, but because, as he's told her years later, a forge with no one young in it eventually goes cold in more ways than one. Otis Pruitt was 61 when Clara came to live above his shop, a widower twice over, his second wife buried not 3 years before, his children grown and scattered to railroads and river towns that did not call him back. He was not a tender man in the way storybooks describe tenderness. He did not coo over her or coddle her grief. Instead, on the morning after her father's burial, he handed her a leather apron 3 sizes too large, rolled the sleeves up himself, and said only, "Well, you'll want something to do with your hands or your mind will eat itself." That was the whole of his condolence, and it was, in its way, the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. The forge became her cathedral. She learned the smell of it before she learned its purpose. The mineral tang of hot iron, the sweet rot of quenching oil, the particular smoke of coal that had been banked low overnight and was being coaxed awake again at dawn. Otis taught her to read fire the way other men read scripture. He showed her the difference between a cherry red heat, good for bending, and a white orange heat, dangerous and fast, good only for welding 2 pieces into one before they could cool and refuse each other. He taught her to listen to the ring of the anvil, how a true strike sang clean and a glancing one thudded dull. The steel itself would tell you, through sound alone, whether you had struck it right. She learned to work the bellows until her shoulders ached. Then to work the treadle hammer Otis had built himself from a salvage mill wheel. Then, when she was perhaps 13, to take up a hammer of her own and strike metal under his patient, unblinking eye. He taught her hinges first, simple things, then nails, then the long, slow art of drawing out a bar of stock into a taper without cracking the grain. He taught her how to read the spark pattern that flew off a piece of unknown steel, held to the grinding wheel, how the color and shape and length of the sparks told you what the metal was made of and what it could become. In the evenings, after the forge had gone quiet and the coals had been banked, he would sit her down with a rag and a small can of oil and teach her to care for tools, to wipe every blade and every hammerhead until it shone, to never, under any circumstance, let a good tool rust from neglect. Tools remember how they're treated, he told her once, turning a ball-peen hammer over in his huge, scarred hands. Treat a tool with respect, and it'll outlast you. Treat it with carelessness, and it'll fail you exactly when you need it most. He was not, she came to understand, only talking about hammers. It was on her 16th birthday that he gave her the hammer that would never leave her hand again. It was not new even then. The handle was hickory, dark with decades of sweat and oil, worn into a shape that fit no hand but the one that had carried it longest, and now, he said, hers. The head was small for a smith's hammer, better suited to fine work than heavy forging. Its face, slightly mushroomed from a lifetime of careful striking, its peen end polished smooth as riverstone from countless hours of riveting and shaping. It had been his own father's hammer, brought from Pennsylvania, and his father's fathers before that. 3 generations of careful hands worn into a single tool. It's not the biggest hammer in this shop, Otis told her, pressing it into her palms, but it's the truest. A good hammer doesn't need to be big. It needs to land exactly where you mean it to land, every single time. That's all skill is, in the end. Knowing exactly where you mean to land, and landing there. She kept it wrapped in a square of oiled cloth in the bottom of her trunk, and on the days she did not work the forge, she still took it out and turned it in her hands, as if some of his certainty might rub off onto her fingers the way the oil had rubbed into the wood. Otis Pruitt died on a cold February morning in 1899, 18 years after he had taken Clara in, not from any accident of fire or iron, but from a pneumonia that settled into his chest after a wet autumn and would not be coaxed back out. He went the way he had lived, quietly and without complaint, refusing the doctor's second visit because he said the first had already told him everything he needed to know. Clara sat with him through the worst of the nights, feeding the small stove in his room, and on the last morning he told her, in a voice gone thin as paper, that the forge was hers now in every way that mattered, whatever any document said. He did not know, dying, that a document would in fact matter very much indeed. Thaddeus Corwin had been waiting, in the patient way of men who measure time and interest accrued, for exactly this moment. He was the president of the Cedar Hollow Trust and Savings, a narrow man with narrow spectacles, who had, 3 years earlier, extended Otis Pruitt a loan against the forge property to replace a roof damaged in a windstorm, a loan Otis had been paying down faithfully every month in small, careful sums. What Clara did not know, because Otis in his quiet pride had never told her, was that Corwin's bank had restructured that note twice in the final year of Otis's illness, each time tightening its terms, each time adding fees that the old smith, weakened and distracted by his failing lungs, had signed so without reading closely. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, Corwin called Clara into his office, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of beeswax and ink, and laid a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "The note is in arrears," he told her, not unkindly, in the tone a man might use to discuss the weather. "Mr. Pruitt's estate has no other assets sufficient to satisfy the balance. The property reverts to the bank as of the 15th. I've arranged $40 for your relocation, which is more, Miss Whitfield, than the terms strictly require. A bank is not our charity. It cannot afford to become sentimental about hammers and horseshoes when a ledger says otherwise." He slid the $40 across the desk in 2 crisp bills and a small stack of coin, and he did not look up again from his papers, as though the matter, having been recorded, was already finished. Clara did not weep, and she did not argue. She had learned, in 18 years above a forge, that some metals will not bend, no matter how long you hold them to the fire, and that the wiser course is sometimes simply to set them aside and shape something else instead. She walked back to the forge in the gray afternoon light, packed what little was hers into a single trunk, wrapped the old hammer carefully in its cloth and laid it on top of everything else. And the next morning she walked to the rail depot and bought a ticket west, toward a place she had heard her father once mention as having decent freight work, a place called Ashford Springs. The train carried her first through country she knew, green and folded and damp with the breath of the river, past fields gone gold green with early wheat, and orchards heavy with the last of the cherry blossoms. But as the miles wore on, the land began to change beneath her, the way a fever changes a face, the green thinning to a duller olive, the trees growing sparser and more twisted, the air through the cracked window losing its sweetness and taking on something drier, dustier, more honest. By the second day, the hills had flattened into long brown swells of grass, the rivers had narrowed to seasonal creeks half dry in their beds, and the towns the train stopped in had a squinting, sun-worn look to them, buildings the color of the dirt they stood on. She watched it all without complaint, her trunk between her boots, the wrapped hammer resting against her knee. And somewhere in that long transformation of the land, she felt something in herself transforming too. The soft give of grief hardening by slow degrees into the harder, more useful material of resolve. Ashford Springs, when she stepped down from the train into its dust and its noon heat, was a town that had clearly known better decades. It had been built in the years when the regional ice trade still mattered, when river ice cut in winter could be packed in sawdust and shipped south to keep meat and dairy and medicine cool through the brutal months of summer, and the bones of that old prosperity still showed in the wide main street and the brick storefronts, half of them now empty, their windows soaped over or simply broken and left that way. She found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Audley Brandt, who charged her 50 cents for a week's lodging in a back room hardly bigger than a pantry, and from Mrs. Brandt she learned that the county would be holding its annual tax auction the following morning, disposing of properties whose owners had vanished, died, or simply stopped paying what was owed on them. The auction was held on the courthouse steps under a sky bleached nearly white with heat, a gathering of perhaps 30 men in shirt sleeves, and a scattering of board boys sent to watch on their father's behalf. Clara stood near the back in her plain gray dress, her trunk left at the boarding house, $11.40 counted twice in a small cloth purse at her waist. The auctioneer, a sweating, jovial man named Pruitt Halsey, worked through a dull list of vacant lots and a collapsing livery stable before he came, almost as an afterthought, to the last item on his sheet. "Last parcel of the day," he called out, consulting his paper with visible disinterest. "The old icehouse property, north end of Mill Street. River frontage, structure included as is. Sealed up by county order back in 1859 after the Troubles, and as far as I know, ain't been opened since. No one's claimed it in 40 years of back taxes, and the county would just as soon see it off the books." "Do I hear $1?" A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. A heavy-set man near the front, a feed merchant named Garrett Coombs, called out, "$1's $1 too much for a haunted icebox, Pruitt, to general amusement." Another man shouted that the only thing inside that ice house after 40 years was rats and regret. Clara waded through the laughter, through the silence that followed it, through a long, hot minute in which it seemed the parcel would go entirely unbid and be struck from the list, and then she raised her hand. $2, she said. The laughter that had been scattered before now gathered into something more pointed, more amused at her specifically. Coombs turned in his seat to look at her properly for the first time, taking in her plain dress and her travel-worn boots, and said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, "Little lady, you'd do better spendings $2 on a hen that lays eggs than on a building that's been dead longer than you've been alive." Halsey, still chuckling, called for any further bids, found none, and brought down his small wooden gavel with a flat crack against the rail of the steps. "Sold to the young lady for $2. County thanks you for your patronage, and may God have mercy on whatever's in there." She paid an exact counted coin, $4.25 laid into Halsey's broad palm one piece at a time, and he wrote her out a receipt by hand on a scrap of ledger paper, the ink scratching dry in places from his pen, the words plain and final, received of Clara M. Whitfield, the sum of $2 in full payment for the Ashford Springs Icehouse property, north end of Mill Street, as is, no further claims. P. Halsey, Centime Auctioneer. She folded the paper twice and placed it inside her purse beside what remained of her $11.40, and she walked north toward Mill Street while the men behind her were still laughing. The icehouse itself sat low and squat near the river's old high water mark, built of thick fieldstone walls nearly 2 feet deep, designed in the old style to hold cold air through a summer's worth of withdrawals. 40 years of weather had grayed its boards and split its door frame, and a county notice, brittle and sun-bleached, nearly to illegability, was still nailed across the entrance, warning against trespass in lettering she could barely make out. She did not have shelter yet that first night beyond Mrs. Brandt's pantry room, and so her first order of practical business was not the ice house at all, but the matter of staying alive in a town that owed her nothing. She secured within her first 2 days a small lean-to-shed behind the boarding house that Mrs. Brandt let her use in exchange for splitting kindling each morning. and she found that the river itself, running cold and clear not 80 yards from the ice house, would serve well enough for washing and, once boiled, for drinking, until she could arrange something more permanent. It was on her second evening in Ashford Springs, hauling a bucket up from the riverbank, that she met the man who would become the only ally she had in that town. He was sitting on an overturned crate near the ice house's north wall, an old man with a face like creased leather and one leg that ended in a wooden peg below the knee, whittling at a stick with a knife so worn its blade had been sharpened down to a thin silver crescent. He introduced himself, without standing, as Reuben Tate, and told her, before she had asked, that he had once worked the ice trade in this very building, back when it employed near 40 men, before the Troubles closed it. "You bought a coffin, girl," he said to her, not unkindly, studying her over the top of his whittling. "Whole town knows it by now. Garrett Coombs has told the story at the saloon 3 times already, and it gets funnier each telling, the way these things do." Clara set down her bucket and said only that a coffin, properly opened, sometimes had more in it than people expected, and Reuben Tate laughed for the first time, a dry, surprised sound, and told her that if she meant to try and open that door, she would want help because the county had not nailed it shut so much as it had buried it shut. Board over board over board, the way men bury things they hope never to think of again. In exchange for whatever she might find inside, worth or not, he offered her his labor and what remained of his knowledge of the building's old bones. And Clara, recognizing in him the kind of quiet, weathered competence she had spent her whole life around, shook his hand and agreed. The labor began the following morning, and it was not labor that yielded quickly. The outer door, when they finally cleared away the rotted boards nailed across it, proved to be swollen shut in its frame by 4 decades of damp and shrinkage, and it took the better part of a full day simply to free its hinges, working a thin wedge of iron between frame and door, tapping it deeper with the flat of a borrowed maul, working the wedge along the whole height of the frame inch by patient inch until the wood finally groaned and gave. The door itself, once freed, revealed a second door behind it, an inner insulated door packed with sawdust between its boards in the old style, meant to seal cold air in, and this one had rusted its iron latch solid. Clara spent the better part of a second day working penetrating oil into the latch mechanism, working it free a fraction of a turn at a time, tapping gently with the peen of her old hammer, rather than risk a hard blow that might shatter rusted iron rather than free it. And it was the careful, almost surgical patience of that hammer's small, true face, landing exactly where she meant it to land, that finally broke the rust's grip without breaking the latch itself. Inside, the ice house was a single long room, its ceiling low and beamed, its floor-packed earth gone hard as stone, and along its north wall stood the old ice racks, rotted now to soft brown lace, where blocks once would have rested between layers of sawdust insulation. The air inside smelled of cold mineral earth and old wood, a smell with no decay in it, only stillness, as though the room had simply been holding its breath for 40 years. It was on the third day of clearing the collapsed racking away from the north wall that Reuben Tate, dragging away a section of rotted shelving, struck the stone wall behind it with the flat of his hand and frowned. "That's hollow," he said. "Whole walls 2 foot of solid fieldstone everywhere else in this building. This patch right here ain't." They spent that afternoon and the next morning working the suspects section of wall, and it was real masonry labor, not a lucky stumble. Clara worked a thin steel pry bar, borrowed from a blacksmith 2 streets over in exchange for a morning of bellows work, into the mortar joints of the suspect stones, finding the mortar there noticeably softer, more recent, than the hard old lime mortar of the original walls. She worked the bar along each joint, tapping it deeper with her hammer, prying gently, resetting, prying again, the patient rhythm of it not unlike drawing out a bar of stock at the forge, and 1 stone at a time, the false section of wall came away, revealing behind it a shallow cavity built between the true outer wall and a thin inner course of brick, just large enough to hold 2 iron-strapped wooden boxes, and wedged between them, a oilcloth-wrapped bundle tied with waxed cord. The first box, when they finally pried its swollen lid free, held money. Silver coin gone dark with age, paper currency from a bank that no longer existed, a sum that Clara, counting it carefully that evening by lamplight at Mrs. Brant's kitchen table, reckoned at just under $4,000. But it was the oilcloth bundle that mattered more, because inside it, wrapped twice against the damp, was a leather ledger book and, folded inside its front cover, a long handwritten letter addressed to no one in particular, signed by a man named Josiah Corwin. The ledger recorded, in cramped, careful entries, the operation of the Ashford Springs Ice Company through the years 1855 to 1859, and the letter, written in a hand grown shaky toward its end, explained what the ledger alone could not. Josiah Corwin, Clara learned, reading by lamplight with Reuben Tate sitting silent across the table, had been the company's bookkeeper and a part owner, and his cousin, a man named Hiram Corwin, had been its principal investor and the president of the very bank that financed it, a bank that was, Clara understood with a slow, cold certainty, the direct forerunner of the Cedar Hollow Trust and Savings now run by Thaddeus Corwin 1,000 miles east. In the winter of 1858, Hiram Corwin had drawn against the company's payroll reserves money set aside to pay nearly 40 ice cutters and haulers for a full season's labor to cover a string of personal debts in a distant city, leaving the company unable to meet its wages. Rather than admit the theft, Hiram had arranged for the bank to call the ice company's operating loan due in full, forcing it into a sudden, engineered bankruptcy, and had personally testified before the county that the company's own mismanagement, not any failure of his, was to blame. The workers, 40 families worth of them, were never paid for that final season. Several left town destitute. One man, the letter noted with a grief that survived even 40 years of paper and damp, had taken his own life rather than face his family with empty hands, and the town, told only that the ice company had simply failed, had blamed bad management and bad luck, and moved on, the way towns do. Josiah Corwin, sick with what he had helped conceal, had quietly diverted what remained of the company's hidden cash reserve, the $4,000 Clara now held, into this wall before the county sealed the building, intending, his letter said, that it should one day go to the men who had earned it and never received it, should anyone ever think to look. He had not had the courage, he confessed, to expose his cousin Hiram while the man lived, fearing the ruin it would bring on his own family's name, and so he had sealed the truth into stone instead, and within the year, ashamed and ill, he had left Ashford Springs for good, and was never heard from again. Clara sat with that letter a long while after Reuben Tate had gone to his bed, turning it over twice in the lamplight, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the truth in iron and fire, exactly what she was holding. Hiram Corwin's bank had become, through inheritance and renaming and the slow churn of generations, Thaddeus Corwin's Cedar Hollow Trust and Savings. The same family, the same cold administrative cruelty dressed up in different decades' clothing, had stolen from 40 ice cutters in 1858 and had taken her own forge from her in 1899, and both times the theft had been recorded neatly, legally, in a ledger, and called business. Word of the find could not, in a town as small as Ashford Springs, stay entirely quiet, and within a week, Garrett Coombs and 2 other men who had laughed loudest at the auction were calling at the boarding house, suggesting, with the particular warmth men reserve for opportunities they did not earn, that property and its contents might rightly belong to the county, or to the town, or perhaps to whoever could make the strongest claim, certainly not solely to the girl who had merely paid $2 for it. A county lawyer, sent for by Coombs, came and looked over the ledger and the letter, and told Clara, not unkindly, that she would be within her rights to fight any such claim in court, that the documents alone might be worth something to a newspaper willing to print the Corwin name in connection with old theft and a man's suicide. Clara listened to all of it with the same stillness she had shown in Thaddeus Corwin's office 1,000 miles away, and she told the lawyer, and Reuben Tate, and eventually Coombs himself, that she had no interest in courts or newspapers. A trial would take the money and tie it in argument for years, she said, and a newspaper story would only humiliate descendants who had never asked to be born into a debt of shame, while the men who had actually gone unpaid in 1858 would still, in the end, be unpaid. What she wanted instead was simpler and, she believed, truer to what Josiah Corwin himself had intended in sealing that money into the wall rather than spending it. She spent the better part of a month working from Josiah Corwin's careful old payroll ledger, tracing the names of the 40 men who had gone unpaid that final season, and where a man himself could not be found, surviving children or grandchildren still living in or near Ashford Springs. She paid out the $4,000 not as a single dramatic gift, but quietly, family by family, in sums calculated as closely as she could reckon to each man's lost wages, with 4 decades of fairness added on top, delivered in plain envelopes with no explanation beyond a short note saying only that a debt long owed had finally come due. To the widow of the man who had taken his own life, she gave the largest single sum, along with the original letter copied out in her own hand, so that the family might know at last that the shame had never been their kin's to carry. What remained after those debts were settled, she put toward reopening a portion of the old icehouse itself as a proper cold storage operation for the town's dairymen and butchers, hiring back 2 of the surviving sons of the original ice cutters to run it, restoring in trade what had been stolen in money. Thaddeus Corwin's bank, 1,000 miles east in Cedar Hollow, never received a single accusing letter, never faced a single lawsuit, and yet within 2 years his name had begun to carry a quiet weight no document could quite explain, a hesitation among certain old families who had, through channels neither Clara nor Reuben Tate ever fully traced, simply heard enough of the old story to begin moving their accounts elsewhere. He lost, eventually, not his freedom but his standing, the slow erosion of a man whose worth had only ever been measured in other people's trust, and that trust, once quietly withdrawn, did not return. In Ashford Springs, Clara became, in the way of small towns that have decided to forgive themselves, simply Miss Whitfield of the Ice House, a name spoken now with a respect that had replaced the old mockery so thoroughly that few remembered, within a year or two, that there had ever been laughter in it at all. Mrs. Brant began sending over jars of preserves without being asked. Garrett Coombs, in a gesture that cost him more pride than coin, brought his own wagon team to help haul gravel for the Icehouse's new loading dock, and never spoke again or coffins. Reuben Tate, who had no family of his own left, took a small room above the restored icehouse and called it, for the first time in 40 years, useful work. When a neighboring widow's gate came loose on its hinge that autumn, Clara repaired it herself one evening after the day's labor, the old hammer's true small face landing exactly where she meant it to land, and the widow, who had not asked for help and had not expected it, simply stood and watched her work in a silence that said more than thanks ever could. On a cool evening in early October, with the new ice operation's first shipment loaded and gone, and the town behind her gone quiet with early dusk, Clara stood once more at the icehouse's threshold, her hand resting the same stone doorframe she had pried free of its rusted hinges months before. She had the old hammer with her, as she always did, its handle worn now into the shape of her own palm, the way it had once been worn into Otis Pruitt's, and she turned it over once in the fading light, thinking of a forge 1,000 miles behind her, and a man who had told her that a good hammer only needed to land exactly where it was meant to land, every single time. She had not understood, the day he gave it to her, that he was teaching her more than a craft. She understood it now, standing in a doorway that had once held nothing but 40 years of silence, and now held a town's quiet, restored faith in itself. It was, she thought, closing her hand once more around the worn old handle, the best $2 she ever spent. Thank you for staying with us through Clara's story tonight. If something in it stayed with you, we'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. We'll leave you with one question to sit with. What have you found value in that others had already written off? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, we wish you warmth, patience, and doors worth opening.